Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Major Chinese cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, have further relaxed their real estate policies with moves to slash taxes on large home transactions. These measures follow a series of stimulus property policies since September, which have already brought noticeable improvements in October. Can we expect more positive market performance in China's property sector as further incremental policies are being implemented in December? How long will it take for the market to bottom out? And what are the main challenges and opportunities as China's housing development shifts from simply addressing availability to focusing on quality? Join us for discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Zhu Ning, Deputy Dean of the Shanghai Advanced Institute of Finance at the Shanghai Jiao Tong University, Liang, Kremer Chair Professor of Economics from Willamette University, and Dr. William Li, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. Welcome to Dialogue. So I started with Professor Zhu Ning. Since November, China's major cities have consecutively announced new policies to boost property sales, such as tax breaks on large homes and also the abolition of the classification of the so-called ordinary and non-ordinary homes when applying for paying taxes on property sales. So what exactly do these policies mean? For those who are not that familiar with the Chinese property sector, explain to us, please.
Well, I think first of all, there is a very big shift in the policy orientation or priority since the September 26th Politburo meeting. So in that Politburo meeting, I think there is a big emphasis on trying to stop the price from falling in the real estate sector, which was like the first time it was mentioned in a long while, and also a very important turnaround in the policy orientation. So I think a few specific policies followed up on that. One of them is about the transaction taxes. What you just referred to about the unification of the classification of the housing is aimed at reducing the transaction taxes for various residential buildings. And also there is further relaxation for eligibility for buying properties in key areas of first-tier cities. So I think there is a very big shift in, well, we have been talking a lot about housing is for living in, not for speculation, but now we're no longer talking that explicitly. And instead, I think we're talking more about how to stabilize the housing sector.
Stabilize the housing sector. I mean, how big a move, let's say, these moves are, are they forceful enough to revive this property sector, Professor Zhu?
I think there has already been some revival in the housing sector. Right after the announcement in late September, we noticed some of the highest transaction volume in the past 2 years during the so-called Golden Week around the National Day holiday around October the 1st. I think the transactions continue to be fairly strong going through October, even though I think some of the more updated numbers indicate that there has been some softening when we're walking into November. And even in a somewhat reduced transaction, I think the activities for the secondary market remains very strong and upbeat. It is still the primary market where people would have to take in certain risks of paying the down payment, but running the potential risk of not getting their apartment. I think that is still a little sluggish.
Yeah, still risks over there. Liang, you're not familiar with the Chinese situation. One of the important factor in terms of living in the big cities is about the hukou, or household registration system. In Guangzhou, one of the first-tier cities in southern China, of course, they introduced new measures to basically enable home buyers to gain local residency, hukou. If you are up to a certain standard, for example, you have paid the social insurance for 1 year, and also if you buy these homes in the certain 7 districts in the city, and then you would be eligible to apply for Guangzhou hukou. So once the policy is implemented, Guangzhou will become the first top-tier Chinese city in tweaking the household registration system to revive home sales. I mean, how significant is this move?
Right. So I think as far as stabilizing the housing price is concerned, this kind of policy is very effective. In fact, we see in November, in October, all those four or five top tier cities, we see the secondhand price of their homes, for example, has become a positive. This is the first time in many months. And so I think these kinds of policies will encourage more home purchases and it will help to stabilize the housing prices. And I think Guangzhou is the city that really take the sort of the pioneering role, right, in relaxing these housing purchase restrictions and also relax hukou restrictions, as one of the first top tier city to do that. Now, that said, I think, it may take some time for other top tier cities to follow suit. And I think that's for a number of reasons. For one is I think there's still concern about speculation in the housing market. If you relax these restrictions too fast and in a very undiscretionary way, it could encourage some speculation. There's also concern about the capacity of this urban space to be able to accommodate a lot more, incoming flows of residents. So if this will be done, it will be done in a more sort of phase out, step-by-step manner. But I do think the relaxing hukou restriction going forward is a long-term trend. Now, one last thing I think is important to also consider is that a lot of times when you see the restrictions relaxed in these big cities, then what happens is people would move from outside of the cities to this, mega big cities. And so that could depress some of the housing markets in these nearby smaller cities. And so that may not be really desirable. And so all of these needs to be taken into account in a more holistic way.
Yeah, it's like a coin, which has two sides. On one hand, if you release or limit these restrictions on the hukou policy, and then there's a tendency that other smaller systems may suffer. But focusing on the hukou system, is it likely? How likely is it? Like Shanghai, other big cities like Shanghai, like Beijing, will also follow? Liang?
Right. So I think yes. So I think it really depends on a number of factors. For one is I think it's important also to understand that urbanization, there's the new infrastructure that needs to be built to make sure that we have the housing, the transportation, and other urban infrastructure that are in place to be able to accommodate more inflows of migrant workers and families. And so I think that is very important, first of all, to consider how to be able to do that. And then on top of that, I think there's also other policy considerations. For example, right now, when we think about pensions, unemployment benefits, and many other policies, they're very much local based. And so it depends on where your hukou is, eventually you will receive the benefits in those localities. So once you relax the hukou restrictions, that means we need to have a major reform in the fiscal system, that people who are moving to the city and get their hukous, then all these benefits would come out from the hukou residency governments. So I think that is another important consideration. How do we make sure that all these policies will light up in place before we have the overhaul of the hukou system?
Mm-hmm. William, on the other side of this market, of course, is the developers. Most of them were in trouble or have been in trouble. For example, this credit crash or cash problem. And then the government stepped in October. For example, they basically set up a white list, so-called white list. And, developers who are inside this white list, then they have, let's say, more room in terms of credit, get easier credit to finish their housing projects. And of course, this a bit earlier than that, the authorities also basically requested to expand the whitelist to cover more developers compliant real estate projects. So, what kind of effects do you think that will have? Basically, what kind of role it will play to bring back, healthy, let's say, growth for this sector?
That's one of the most important and fundamental parts of the reforms that I've heard that really will do something to address the excess capacity in the real estate property market, because making sure that the flats and apartments and houses that people have already paid for are actually built will go a long way to restoring confidence that the wealth that they have decided to invest in actually will be there. And I think the pre-sale model that has been used so far by so many of these developers shows that huge vulnerability where people have paid or have indebted themselves, and yet they have no asset to show afterwards. So the whitelist and expanding that whitelist is, I think, a very important fundamental part of the reforms that are put in place to try to bolster confidence that wealth in property market will actually be there and will show up as actual ownership. I think in terms of the nature of the reforms that have been put in place, Professor Zhu and Yan have talked about very important aspects of the reforms, but a lot, at least from the Western perspective, it's almost like putting a Band-Aid and giving an aspirin to a cancer victim. It really doesn't address the fundamental reasons why there's so much excess capacity. Having lived through the asset market bubbles in the United States and in 2008 and in Japan before that, the amount of adjustment that has to take place to bring prices back down to any kind of equilibrium level hasn't even begun, I think, in China. And I think the measures that have been put in place are really, just icing on the cake and really have to address the fundamental issue of excess capacity, not in the primary cities, but in the secondary cities and tertiary cities. Those are, I think, places where people have bought a lot of property, and now they feel that they've lost it. And that wealth loss, I think, is one of the big drags on the Chinese economy right now.
William, talk more about that. You mentioned about the U.S., the housing bubble, Japanese bubble over there, early 2000, and then, the Japanese one lasted, 20 years about. So you say the Chinese sector, this is just probably the beginning. And you see the bubble is still there, or are we going to see the price has to go down to a more solid foundation? Or the government purpose is very clear, that is to stabilize the property sector. They don't like to see the sharp rise of the price or sharp coming down. That's not something they are pursuing here.
Well, I guess my real question is, you want to stabilize property market? Yes, but at what price? Professor Liang has talked about how there's some signs of price increase in the secondary market, but we're talking minuscule amounts of perhaps relative speculative changes in Shanghai and Guangzhou and the top cities. The prices in the other parts of China's real property market, where the bulk of Chinese citizens have put their wealth, have no signs of showing that kind of increase. So I think the key to restoring asset market a bubble and restore equilibrium is to have prices drop to where they will clear. And right now, prices, I don't think, have dropped enough to clear the markets in a way that allows people to be confident and say, okay, we are now having reasonably priced flats, reasonably priced property all over China, and now I can go and buy places where I think I will be living, because that's where the employment is. And that really is the key. People will go and buy property where there are jobs. And where the jobs are going to be is going to depend more on the overall economic policies in China for the new industries that are being developed and where President Xi is focusing a lot of the development. So the property market cannot be divorced from the overall economic growth in different sectors of the Chinese economy. And right now, the lack of demand has really made the decision as to where the equilibrium price of the property market will be very difficult, because the question, my question from as an outsider is, where are the jobs going to be, and how much are the jobs going to pay, right? Those are the questions, the fundamental support for the property market. Having a 50 basis point reduction in your mortgage, to me, is totally irrelevant. When you have this kind of disequilibrium that you have in China right now, as we had in Japan and as we had in the United States.
Okay,
I would like to follow up on what William said about
Go ahead.
about the fundamental support. I mean, I wrote a book titled "China's Guaranteed Bubble" in 2016, and in that, I think I was trying to caution China about not trying to repeat the example of Japan or America. I think there are two things which are, I think William alluded to both points. One is, I think with the softening in the housing prices, which has been going on over the past 3 years or so, we have to keep in mind that the rent is coming down as well. So I think even though we're having quite a significant price correction on the housing price, it doesn't necessarily mean that the housing are necessarily becoming cheaper, because relative to their ability to generate a yield, which is the rent, it is not improving as much as how the housing prices adjustment has suggested. So I think that is one big change in the past year or so. Another very important aspect of my research, along with Bob Schiller at Yale, is in the housing bubble. I mean, people have this tendency to buy when the prices are going up. They don't have the tendency to buy when the prices are coming down. Well, they're pretty much speculating in the markets. They're only buying when they're believing the housing prices are going up and they're making them richer. So I think this is one big component in China's housing markets for at least a decade in the past. But now if you're taking that component out of the picture, then of course you're having, as William correctly alluded to, you're having an even bigger disequilibrium in a way that what the overcapacity or the excess supply is on one side, but on the other hand, you're having a sudden drop in demand. Basically, all those people who are trying to invest or speculate in the housing market are no longer touching the market. So I think that adjustment, I agree with William, would take far longer than what we have just experienced. I wouldn't say this is the beginning, but I think this is probably the end of the beginning.
Yes, okay. So still, yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
if I may, yes, I don't necessarily disagree with what has been said, but I also want to remind ourselves, since this 3 red lines policy has been put in place, we have seen the housing transaction has gone down from 18 trillion a year at the peak of 2021 to now about 8-9 trillion yuan. So we are talking about
around 700 million. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry.
So we're talking about half of what we used to see in terms of the housing sales. And right now, yes, there is still a lot of incomplete projects, which is why the government is taking active policies to address those. And the government has indicated that the 4 million houses being completed this year through this whitelist program, and now they double the amount of the financial support to 4 trillion to allow for more completion of these projects. Now, there's also, of course, 16 million by or give or take the housing inventory that needs to be digested. But again, I think in the short term, we have all this policy support, and we know that Minister of Finance Lan Fuan mentioned in October that the government is going to also set up more at the local government level, more funds for housing purchases for social housing. Now, we didn't hear this in the November standing committee meeting of the MPC, but it's very likely that policy is going to roll out at some point and improve the short-term demand for housing. And then going long-term, again, I think that there's a lot of concern about demographic changes and so on and so forth. But again, China's urbanization rate now is still 65%. And there's still another 10 or 15, even 20 percentage points increase in the urbanization rate. We're also looking at, for example, marriage rates. As a matter of fact, 2023, we're seeing 7.68 million couples register marriages, and that's a 12% increase from the year before. We're also seeing 18.78 million primary school enrollment students, and that is up again from about 17 million the year before. So we're seeing the households are still being formed, and people are still having kids that are coming to the urban cities and trying to go to school, and they need houses and maybe bigger houses. We're also seeing back in 2014, the average residential size is about 25 square meters. And now 2024, we're talking about 42 square meters. And we'll continue to see the kind of upgrading in terms of both floor size, but also in terms of upgrade houses, because the houses got old, they would need to be replaced and renovated. So I think, the real demographic changes had the more negative impact maybe, by 2035. So I do think that, yes, there is adjustment continuously in terms of the housing prices. And I think Goldman Sachs has put, and many others, S&P also made a projection that probably it's not until the second half of next year that we'll start to see, the bottom out of the housing prices. But I don't think that we need to see another 25 or 30% of reduction in the housing prices to reach that so-called equilibrium level. Because again, we have active policies, and we have some of those long-term structural forces, and we also have structural reforms that are underway. So I think all of this would help to put some floor. And my last point here is that we're seeing the real estate sector now is only contributing about 15% of GDP, down from used to be 30%, 25%. And the United States is about 15 to 18%. Japan right now is about 12%. So I don't think we're really that far from that kinds of sort of equilibrium level.
Professor Zhu Ning, I want to have your your opinion, but also, as Liang mentioned, Goldman Sachs predicted that the China market is going to bottom out during the second half of next year. What do you make of it? Too optimistic, or is it realistic?
When we talk about a national housing market, I think there's never a national housing market. It's always an aggregation of very different municipalities and many different regions. So the same applies for the U.S. I mean, you cannot compare San Francisco to Houston, for example. That would be comparing apples to oranges. So in a way, I think I tend to think different tier cities will have a very different pattern when it comes down to the transaction volume and in terms of the price trends. I do feel that, well, the first tier cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, tend to have the best chance of seeing the price stabilize and the volume coming back. I mean, after all, I agree with Ian that, well, there are still going to be more people coming into those first tier cities for better job opportunities, for better professional development and personal enjoyment. So I think that is not what I would worry about. What I would worry about is what I think William alluded to very briefly, are the lower tier cities, the third cities or cities whose name you have never heard of. And that is actually the bulk of the cities by numbers. And for many of those cities, they have already experienced population outflow over the past 2 or 3 years. And they're already experiencing a very drastic drop in the fiscal revenue, which is limiting the public resources being provided by local governments. So put everything together, those are the cities which I would be really worried about. And then we're already seeing cities such as Hegang in Heilongjiang province, where you can buy a full flat for less than $10,000 US. And I wouldn't be surprised that more and more cities will be going into that direction, rather than going into joining the ranks of having apartments which are selling for over $20,000 US per square meter. In short, I think it will take a little bit longer, in my view, before the prices will bottom and before the market really cleared.
Professor Zhu Ning, of course, you mentioned in a recent interview that the attitudes of the younger generation, I guess that's also, it's kind of a psychological sector or generation changes, for the young people, they don't trust investing in the housing sector. So very different from the previous generations, I would say. Tell us more on that, how big a factor is that?
Yeah, I think that is something that we have to pay close attention to. And in a way, I don't think the current policy orientation has fully reflected how the younger generation has changed their view about the housing sector. In a way, I think the younger generation has experienced the 3 major changes, which the older generation who have benefited so much from the housing sector boom in the past decades, who have never experienced or even imagined in their wildest dreams. One is when the housing prices could potentially come down by 20, 30, 40% in different cities. This has never happened in China's economic history in the past half a century. 2 is they put down their life savings, sometimes the life savings of their parents and in-laws, and they end up with not being able to get their apartment, which is really putting a big risk factor to the housing as an investment. And finally, I think the job market has become far less friendly than before COVID. So I think even for people who can afford a housing and then put down their life savings for down payment, they do worry about whether I can keep my job, whether my salary is going to rise, whether I can afford paying the mortgage. So I think those major changes have happened. So I think the reduction in the mortgage interest rate, the relaxation of certain eligibility requirements, they are very supportive. But I think for stabilizing the housing market, I think the government has to do more, not only to stabilize the macroeconomy, but also to bring back the confidence in the housing sector as an investment.
Liang, during this his appearance at the recent exhibition center in Beijing, Chinese Premier Liang said, China needs to build high-quality smart homes to better cater to residents' needs, while accelerating the renovation of aging, housing units amid a modern urbanization drive. Of course, he's also talking about this, potentially driving trillions of yuan, of investment and consumption. He emphasized, the shift from simply addressing availability issue, meaning housing units available to the buyers, but also focusing on quality. So what do you make of the Premier's remarks?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think, modernization of the economy, it's not just in the manufacturing sector, but I think the residential housing sector is definitely a great place and have the potential for this kinds of upgrade. And of course, that would help to boost investment. It would also help to, again, promote more sort of the new housing sales when people wanted to upgrade their living spaces and their living experiences. I also want to just follow up back on the point about yes, income is important, jobs are important, and so on and so forth. And I also agree. I think the real estate sector's importance is not on the supply side. So we do know that the residential investment has gone down by about 2 trillion yuan a year, but the manufacturing investment has gone up by also about 2 trillion. So that helped to sort of offset, right, on the supply side. But it's more the demand side when people's housing value is declining and 70% of the wealth is in the housing sector, then that does in some ways reduce consumer confidence and so on and so forth. But again, I think the most recent data have suggested that retail sales have gone up. People's confidence it's gradually coming back. But just like, the marriage rates and also the primary school enrollments that I mentioned earlier, it is only just for 2023. So it's not yet clear it's a trend or it's just one blip. Same with, the confidence from the consumer sector. But that said, I think it's important to keep in mind, again, the policies are still not completely sort of rolled out yet. We know the fiscal stimulus is really not being, I think, very clear at this point. I think one of the reasons, as many analysts are arguing, is we want to keep the powder dry, want to see how to respond to Donald Trump's policies and so on and so forth. But the matter of fact is that I think we have seen recent macroeconomic policy pivot. That the policymakers have put more emphasis on stabilizing growth and achieving that growth target. And again, I think President Xi is clear that by 2035, we want to have the GDP double the level of 2020, which means from now on, we need 4.7% of growth rate and higher. And so I think, if the policies are going to fall in place, if we're going to see, local governments having more ammunitions, right, that they will be able to help to promote local economies, create jobs at the local level, especially in the service sector. I think that is very important. When you look at investments in the service sector, so far in the first 10 months, it was actually negative. So we really need to expand the service sector because that is the big job creator in the service sector. Manufacturing sector is being upgrading, it's been improving quality, but the employment ratio has gone down from 27% now 10 years ago to now only 22%. So, manufacturing sector is not going to create enough jobs. We need a service sector, and to develop that, we need more investment. We need more government policy support. We need to steer more, college graduates to work in some of the high value added service sector. So I think all of these are important to support the economy going forward.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.